My speech today is about how the universe and the earth were created as narrated to us in the Quran. There are 16 verses in 7 chapters of the Quran that describe the sequence of creation, and we will be scientifically analyzing them in order to see how they are coherent with each other and how they fit with our current scientific knowledge. Before we start, we want to emphasize that there has been a sharp development of mankind's scientific knowledge in the last few decades, so there is not yet a collective agreement among Muslim scholars on how these 16 Quranic verses should be interpreted. This video integrates our current scientific knowledge with the authentic interpretations of Prophet Muhammad's companions, and it summarizes our own interpretation and understanding of these 16 verses in a simplified scientific language, and Allah knows best how successful we were. Let's start with what the Quran says regarding the duration of the creation of the universe and the earth. Allah says,
وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا فِي 6 أَيَّامٍ وَمَا مَسَّنَا مِن لُغُوبٍ.
And we did certainly create the heavens and the earth and what is between them in 6 days, and no weariness touched us. In this verse, God clearly emphasizes that the universe and the earth were created in 6 days. Although the definition of a day is well known, some Muslim scholars have interpreted the 6 days mentioned in this verse to mean 6 stages. However, this cannot be true because the Quran makes it clear that there were only 3 stages of creation. Allah doesn't differentiate between the events of days 1 and 2, days 3 and 4, or days 5 and 6. In other words, the first 2 days were a stage, the second 2 days were a stage, and the last 2 days were a stage. So, the term day in this verse most probably refers to the common day that we are all familiar with. Throughout this video, we will stick to this apparent meaning of the word day. So, what is the scientific definition of a day? The term day refers to a solar day, which is the amount of time it takes the Earth to complete a full rotation around its axis with respect to the sun. In other words, it is the amount of time it takes for someone on the Earth to witness sunrise, noon, sunset, and sunrise again. This means that a day doesn't have to be 24 hours. In fact, the day actually differs in length throughout the year. December 22nd is the longest day of the year, and it is equal to 24 hours plus 30 seconds. September 16th is the shortest day of the year and is equal to 24 hours minus 21 seconds. Also, 420 million years ago, the day was only 21 hours long. If the Earth does not rotate around its axis with respect to the sun throughout its orbit, a day will never pass. In other words, the sun would appear to freeze and not move across the sky. We believe that this occurred during all 6 days of creation. It took the Earth millions of years to rotate once around its axis with respect to the sun during all the days of creation. And the first day of creation lasted billions of years. Now let's discuss how day 1 started. What happened at the beginning of time? Allah says, "Have those who disbelieved not considered that the heavens and the earth were a joint entity, and we exploded them?" Allah also says, "And the heaven we constructed with strength, and indeed we are its expander." These 2 verses clearly describe what scientists now call the Big Bang. The Big Bang theory states that the Earth and the rest of the universe started as a tennis ball sized but extremely dense body that exploded 13.82 billion years ago. As a result, the universe immediately started expanding, and it will continue to expand until the end of time. So, the Big Bang was the first event that started day 1 as stated by both the Quran and science. It is important to note that there isn't a collective agreement among scientists regarding the exact dating of many creation events such as the Big Bang, but they are mostly in agreement on the duration and the relative sequence of the majority of these events. For example, in 2012, NASA measured that the Big Bang took place 13.77 billion years ago. However, in 2013, the Planck Space Telescope in Europe measured that the Big Bang took place 13.82 billion years ago. For simplicity, we just picked the most agreed upon number, in this case 13.82 billion years ago, and ignored the rest. Immediately after the Big Bang, the universe was under a tremendous amount of pressure and its temperature was over 1 billion degrees Celsius. These extreme conditions prevented the formation of atoms. It wasn't until 380,000 years after the Big Bang that the universe cooled down to 3,000 degrees Celsius, which allowed electrons to orbit nuclei and form the hydrogen and helium gases that fill the vast majority of the universe. The first stars formed around 100 to 200 million years after the Big Bang, but they quickly exploded in gigantic supernovae that formed new, heavier elements. Our Milky Way galaxy started to form from a massive cloud of gas and dust around 12.6 billion years ago. This cloud of gas and dust flattened and formed a disk roughly 8.8 billion years ago. The material inside this disk started to rotate with huge velocities and formed our galaxy's current spiral shape 6.5 billion years ago. During this time, the sun, the earth, and the rest of our solar system were still smoke and dust. About 4.603 billion years ago, a disturbance, most probably a supernova explosion, occurred in a small part of our Milky Way galaxy and caused a huge cloud to collapse on itself. This formed a solar nebula, which was the beginning of our solar system. The solar nebula was made up of 99% gases and only 1% fine dust particles. 71% of the gases were hydrogen and 27% of them were helium. As the solar nebula continued to collapse in on itself, it became denser and denser. The majority of gases and dust particles were pulled towards its center and created a protosun, which would eventually become our sun. Because of the heat generated from the rushing gases and radioactive decay, a substantial amount of heat accumulated within the protosun. At the end of day 2, the protosun was mainly gaseous and its temperature reached 1750 degrees Celsius. However, since a temperature of at least 10 million degrees Celsius is required to start nuclear fusion, this temperature was still way too low to ignite the sun. During this time, the protosun had a mass that was roughly 10% that of our current sun. When the solar nebula collapsed and flattened 4.6 billion years ago, the heat released from radioactive decay was trapped inside the foggy cloud. This caused the dust particles to melt and form molten chondrules that were roughly 0.1 to 1 millimeter in diameter. These chondrules were too small to attract each other through gravity, but they had electrostatic charges that caused them to group together and form large clumps of dust and chondrites throughout the solar system. When some of these chondrule clumps reached diameters of half a kilometer, their gravitational field drew in more chondrules, dust particles, and smaller clumps of debris towards them. This caused them to grow much faster and they formed countless meteoroids, asteroids, and planetismals. When all these solid objects started rotating around the protosun, they were able to obtain even more materials and they continued to grow in size until some of the planetismals became protoplanets. One of these protoplanets was Proto-Earth, which would eventually become the Earth. This proto-Earth had only 10% of the current Earth's mass, and it is what Allah refers to as Earth when He says, "Say, do you indeed disbelieve in He who created the Earth in 2 days?" It can be understood from this verse that the Earth became a fully fledged protoplanet when its accumulated solid materials completed 2 rotations around their axis with respect to the Sun. Some scientists believe that proto-Earth started to melt at this time, 4.567 billion years ago, as stated in the formation of the solar system, which was published in 2015 by Susan Fasner and her colleagues. Now let's discuss the events that took place in days 3 and 4. As everything continued to rotate around the protosun during the 3rd and 4th days, solid bodies collided into each other and the vast majority of them were swallowed by the protosun. Only 4 terrestrial planets survived until today. Proto-Earth and the protosun continued to grow in size and mass by sucking in chondrules, dust particles, and gases. No dramatic changes were made to the solar system during days 3 and 4. All the events of these 2 days were just continuations of events from days 1 and 2. Because of this, Allah did not differentiate the events of the 3rd and 4th day from the event of the 1st and 2nd days in the Quran. Allah refers to the events of all 4 days together when He says, "And He, Allah, placed in the earth firmly set mountains over its surface, and He blessed it and determined therein its creatures' sustenance in 4 days." This verse clearly states that during the first 4 days of creation, mountains were set on top of Proto-Earth's surface. As previously mentioned, while Proto-Earth was rotating around the protosun during the first 4 days of creation, its gravity pulled in countless chondrite rocks, asteroids, and possibly some small planetismals. When these entities collided with Proto-Earth, they formed huge piles the size of mountains on top of Proto-Earth's surface. These mountain accumulations were completely different from the mountains we see today, which form from plate tectonics that push giant slabs of rock upward from beneath the Earth's surface and have their roots deep within the Earth's crust. This is why Allah emphasized in this verse that the mountains in the first 4 days were set on top of the Earth's surface. At the end of day 4, Proto-Earth grew to the size of a small planet. In this same verse, Allah also gives us more information regarding what He placed in the earth during the first 4 days. Allah says, "And He blessed it, the earth, and determined therein its creatures' sustenance in 4 days." So, how did Allah bless the earth and create sustenance for all the creatures that would inhabit it before the end of day 4? The answer is through the creation of the minerals and nutrients in the rocks and soil that all living things would rely on for survival. Plants are able to absorb these nutrients and minerals directly from the soil, and when an animal eats a plant, the nutrients are transferred to the animal, and this process continues up the food chain. In other words, all the necessary elements that are required to support life were created in the first 4 days. As gases rushed towards the protosun, they collided with each other. This accretion energy caused the protosun's temperature to increase. At the beginning of day 3, the core temperature of the protosun reached 10,000 degrees Celsius and it acquired enough mass to become a T-Tauri star. The distinguishing characteristic of the T-Tauri star was its outward bipolar flows that were perpendicular to its protoplanetary disk. Still, the T-Tauri star didn't start nuclear fusion. Similarly, there were two reasons the Earth's temperature increased. First, the accretion energy that was released when rocks and asteroids accelerated due to the Earth's gravity and then impacted its surface, and second, the radioactive decay of nuclear elements spread throughout the dust and rocks. During the formation of Proto-Earth, all the elements were dispersed randomly throughout the Earth. However, when the Earth's temperature increased until these elements started to melt, the heavy minerals such as iron and nickel sank to the center of the Earth and formed its solid metal core. The lighter materials such as the silica rocks floated to the Earth's surface and formed the Earth's crust when they cooled down. This process of separating the Earth's elements based on density is called Earth differentiation, and it was a critical and necessary stage of the Earth's creation. Scientists do not know when or how long ago Earth differentiation happened, but it seems that it was a very complex process that happened irregularly throughout a 717 million year period from the end of day 2 until 667 million years after the end of day 6. Before we discuss the events of days 5 and 6, it is important to clarify that it can be understood from the verses of creation in the Quran that Allah divided creation into two categories: compulsory creation, meaning creation from nothing, and evolutionary creation, meaning the natural creation or modification of existing matter through the laws of physics and biology. Our analysis of the Quranic verses led us to conclude that there was room in the first 4 days for compulsory creation. For example, all matter, energy, space, and time had to be created from nothing at the very beginning, which directly contradicts all the laws of physics. Similarly, before the end of day 4, life had to be created from non-living materials, which directly contradicts all the laws of biology. We believe that Allah created the seeds of life and possibly non-living forms containing DNA as complicated matter and embedded them into the rocks and dust before the end of the 4th day about 4.543 billion years ago. 830 million years afterwards at the latest, under certain suitable conditions, these seeds produced the first living organisms called archaea. This would explain why, after describing what happened in the first 4 days, Allah says, "Then he directed himself to the heaven while it was smoke and said to it and to the earth, 'Come into being willingly or by compulsion.' They said, 'We have come willingly.'" Even though Allah knew the situation of the heavens and the earth better than they themselves, He gave them the choice to come into being willingly or by compulsion. This was so that they would confirm their situation and let us understand more about the state of their creation. We understand from this verse that Allah asked the universe and the earth whether or not they needed more help or support from Him or the angels with changing their situation and bringing all the necessary creation that would come from them afterwards. In other words, Allah asked them if they still needed compulsory creation or if evolutionary creation would be enough from that moment onward. They responded very clearly and said that they would be able to do it by their own means. So, only evolutionary creation was involved in the events that took place after the end of the 4th day. After the heavens and the earth responded, Allah ordered them to voluntarily complete dividing themselves into 7 heavens. Allah says, "And He, Allah, completed them as 7 heavens within 2 days and inspired in each heaven its command. And we adorned the nearest heaven with lamps." So Allah only ruled that the heavens should complete dividing itself into 7 heavens and that the lowest heaven should be decorated with the sun and the stars. Then the heaven fully executed the order following the laws of physics. We understand from this verse that the heaven was already divided into 6 heavens at the end of day 4. Then during days 5 and 6, Allah ordered it to divide into an additional heaven. This was accomplished mainly by creating the nearest heaven to the earth, which we believe to be something similar to the Oort cloud that surrounded the solar system after it was cleared by the solar wind. We estimated that days 5 and 6 together lasted about 24 million years, which would have been too short a time period to have a significant impact on the 7 heavens as a whole. During days 1 through 4, the entire solar system was filled with chondrules and dust particles that prevented any light from reaching the earth. In other words, if you were standing on the earth during this time, the world would be completely black. However, if you were outside the solar system during the first 4 days, it would be very clear to you that the skies were already decorated with millions of stars. In days 5 and 6, once the solar winds blew the chondrules and dust particles that were inside the solar system to its outer edges, the lowest heaven that encompasses the earth was created and adorned with the stars that were already shining for billions of years. Since the stars are spread throughout the entire universe, we expect that they are not a part of the nearest heaven even though they are a part of its decoration. Similarly, we expect that the planets in our solar system are much closer to earth than the nearest heaven. However, Allah considers their lighted surfaces as a part of the nearest heaven's decoration. Allah says, "Indeed, we have adorned the nearest heaven with an adornment of the planet." Allah doesn't say that He decorated the nearest heaven with the planets as they do not emit light. Instead, He says that He decorated it with the decoration of the planets, which means the light that is reflected off their surfaces. Allah also describes the events of the first 4 days in another chapter of the Quran and says, "It is He, Allah, who created for you all of that which is on the earth. Then He directed Himself to the heaven and made them 7 heavens." How did Allah create everything that we now see on the earth before He directed Himself to the heaven in the beginning of the 5th day? As explained before, Allah created the minerals and nutrients in the rocks and soil that all living things would rely on for survival. Allah also embedded the seeds of life in the soil before the end of the 4th day. These seeds of life would later produce all the plants and animals that we see today. It also appears that earth differentiation had already started by that time, which allowed the light rocks and soil to float to the earth's surface and hold all the necessary elements that would later support life and humans' creation and sustenance. During each of the 6 days of creation, the earth made millions of orbits around the sun, but rotated only one time around itself with respect to the sun. Even though the earth was constantly acquiring dust, chondrite rocks, and asteroids, these collisions didn't cause it to spin faster around its axis, which is why the length of the day was so long. However, near the end of the 6th day, the giant impact or big splash theory states that a giant asteroid called Theia that had about 10% of the current Earth's mass impacted the Earth and melted huge areas of the Earth's surface. The materials that broke off from the Earth's surface due to the collision eventually joined together and made the moon, which started orbiting the Earth. This giant impact ended the last portion of the 6th day very quickly because it caused the Earth to spin around its axis at very high velocities. Suddenly, one rotation of the Earth around itself with respect to the sun became about 5 hours instead of millions of years. Millions of years after the giant impact, the entire Earth's surface cooled again and formed the current Earth crust that we know today. Since the time of the giant impact, which occurred 4.527 billion years ago, the speed at which the Earth rotates around itself has slowed and the length of the day has become longer. It changed from the 5 hours immediately after the impact to the 24 hours that we have today. After 200 million years from now, the day on the Earth will be 25 hours. Just before the end of day 4, the sun's surface temperature exceeded 3,700 degrees Celsius. At that time, the sun's volume was twice that of our current sun, and it also emitted more light than our current sun even though there was no nuclear reaction taking place. However, none of this light reached the Earth because of the dust and condols that filled the entire solar system. Once the sun consumed all its matter and acquired its current mass, it became a pre-main sequence star. When that happened, there was no more accretion energy available to heat up the sun, and its surface temperature started to cool and become more dense. This caused a stronger contraction force on the sun's core and increased its temperature through gravitational contraction. After the T-Tauri star became a pre-main sequence star, it started to release strong solar winds that slowly blew away the dust and chondrule particles from inside the inner solar system. Very slowly, the light from the sun started to reach the Earth at noontime. Then the daylight duration started to be longer and the sunlight was recognizable for a few hours before and after noontime. Allah says, "Are you a more difficult creation or is the heaven? Allah constructed it. He raised its ceiling and proportioned it. And He darkened its night and extracted its brightness around noontime." Before the end of the 6th day, the sunrise and sunset were recognizable on the Earth. After the 6 days, Allah continues and says, "And the earth after that He bombarded and spread it." Why did Allah use the words "and after that" before He tells us that He bombarded and spread the earth? It is because Allah has finished discussing the events of the 6 days of creation and is now talking about the events that happened 550 million years after the end of day 6. Please note that the word dahaha that is used in this verse can be translated as repeatedly improved, expanded, enlarged, flattened, or hit with stones. The Arabic word ad-dahih is still commonly used today to describe the person who keeps repeating and improving what he is doing. The Arabic word al-madahi or al-midhah is an old game played by Arab children, including Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein, the 2 grandsons of Prophet Muhammad, where players make a hole in the ground and then keep throwing stones from a distance towards the hole, and the winner is the player who gets more stones inside the hole. Due to the repeated force of throwing the stones, the area around the hole is fragmented into small pieces. 1400 years ago, Arabs didn't know how to make a connection between the word dahaha that is mentioned in this Quranic verse and the stages of the earth's creation. However, the 3 main books of the Quran interpretation, named At-Tabari, Al-Qurtubi, and Ibn Kathir, include an Arabic poetry verse in order to explain the meaning of this word. The Arabic poet used the word dahaha to describe the effect of very heavy rain on soil and rocks. He says, "When the rough and heavy rain falls continuously, it pulls the skin of the rocks and fragments them into small pieces as if the rain was a player of the earth stoning game named Al-Madahi." Using the current scientific knowledge, the best scientific English translation of this word is bombarded it, which refers to the known earth accretion and bombardment process. This process occurred during the late heavy bombardment period of the Earth's history for 150 million years from 3.97 to 3.82 billion years ago. During this period, scientists predict that Jupiter moved closer to the sun and caused a ripple effect in the asteroid belt. This flung many asteroids towards the sun due to the sun's gravity. On their way to the sun, countless numbers of them bombarded the Earth's surface as well as the surfaces of the other terrestrial planets. Allah says, "And the earth, after that, He bombarded and spread it. He extracted from it its water and its pasture. and the mountains he set firmly, as provisions for you and your grazing livestock. The apparent meaning of these verses is that the bombardment of the earth extracted water from within the earth and brought it up to the earth's surface. Then, almost immediately afterwards, life began on the earth, and the archaea, which are the oldest known unicellular organisms, were created at least 3.71 billion years ago. In addition, after the earth's surface cooled down and formed the earth's crust, plate tectonics pushed giant slabs of rock upward from beneath the earth's surface and formed mountains that were firmly rooted within the earth's crust. These mountains were completely different than those that were piled up on top of the earth's surface in the first 4 days due to the earth's collisions with asteroids and chondrite rocks.